So the latest Nintendo Direct dropped, and with it, we got our first new Fire Emblem game announced for the Nintendo Switch 2 in Fire Emblem Fortune's Weave. This one, it's a little weird. I don't necessarily mean that the trailer is bad or out there. It's not giving off whatever happened to the Fire Emblem games that I love vibes. It's honestly the most intrigued I've been with a Fire Emblem game in a long time. But it is a little bit unusual. Most of the Fire Emblem games tend to take their aesthetics from civilizations or kingdoms set in the medieval era. Even something like Fates was inspired by Sengoku Jidai, which, well, medieval Japan. But Fortune's Weave seems to be taking a page or two from the classical era. Heavy chariots that predate humankind, breeding horses big enough for heavily armored knights to lead a charge, the Roman god Sol Invictus, the Colosseum and its many examples of entertainment, raining arrows as if each were plucked from the skies of a skirmish from a Numidian kingdom, and a city that seems reminiscent of Phoenicia or the empire that was settled by its people, Carthage. It's refreshing to see them go with a seemingly more ancient world while still being recognizably Fire Emblem, both in terms of its gameplay as well as its visuals. And aesthetically, there's a lot to suggest that this world is less advanced than that of the one with the Garrigmok Monastery and the trio of lords that make up the titular three houses. And also there's a gun. Yeah, we see what appears to be a gun or some sort of handheld weapon that might use gunpowder but does shoot some It's a gun. It's a gun. There's no other way to describe it. It is a gun. Some people have suggested this might be a reference to what Sylvain was talking about in Three Hopes, a projectile launcher that can be used by non-magic casters, in some cases for civilians for self-defense. So apparently Sylvain is a part of the NRA, and there's some other potential explanations, theory crafting one can come up with that would fit a prequel, like maybe this is some ancient technology that was lost to time and only those who slither in the dark were able to make the most of. I mean, if they're able to have nukes or like some sort of long-range missiles in Three Houses, I guess the world of a prequel could have somebody pull out an anima magic power Glock. Speaking of use, Crests are back, and if you remember anything about the Great Edelgard Discourse War of 2019, you'll know that was a particularly contentious matter due to how they shaped Fulden's society, as well as how a certain war criminal, one of many, used them as a justification for invading a foreign nation. Again, one of many. Snark aside, that is the main reason why this game's premise is so interesting. Because, be it prequel or sequel, there's a lot of implications for the world of Three Houses to build further on the ideas, the lores, and especially the themes of its predecessor. Honestly, I didn't expect them to ever make a game that's directly connected to Three Houses in any way. Yes, the game sold well, the best-selling title in franchise history, but following it up is going to be difficult no matter what, and not just because of the high standards that it created for the franchise, but because of the impact a potential sequel would have on the world. In terms of storytelling, there's so many questions you have to answer if you're making a follow-up. If it's a sequel specifically, do you decide to canonize a particular route? If so, which one? Or do you take a more broad approach and incorporate some of the ideas from each of the routes and try to make them seem like they were all very valid paths that could lead to this particular future? Perhaps even make commentary on the ideals that the trio of leaders, or even the trio of Ceros, espoused. Like Edelgard wanted to make a crestless society where merit is the main form of currency. If this is a continuation of Three Houses' themes and ideas, what does it say about those ideas and themes for us to be in a world where things have seemingly gone backwards? Like I said earlier, the world appears to be taking inspiration from ancient Rome and its rival of Carthage, neither of which were really known for being meritocratic, especially Rome. Come to think of it, with Sothis talking about being forgotten so soon, whether that's a cheeky callback to Fire Emblem Three Houses or something directed at a specific character, one can draw a parallel to how the state religion of, say, Rome radically changed under the Roman Republic to the Empire, which one can interpret as commentary on organized religions or the institutions that prop it up, as commentary on the idea of legacy, how time marches on and the world around us grows further and further from what we came to know. It's entirely possible the reason the visual design brings to mind those empires of old wasn't to make one think about the lore and whether this fits into the timeline before or after, but the implication of our heroes' actions and ideas, what they fought for in Three Houses, and whether their choices mattered at all, whether they were good ideas to begin with, whether they had an impact on the world, and if that impact had any positive or negative staying power for a generation or 2 or 10? And if they do succeed, how much credit can you truly take when you weren't at the helm? If they do thrive, for how long before the wrong ruler turns all that good you've done into dust? A mere tablet discovered thousands of years later, testifying to your greatness in a world seemingly untouched by all your deeds, devoid of your own legacy. Three Houses was pretty critical of the divine right of kings, and especially on the notion of the power structure inherent in a hereditary monarchical society with a powerful theocratic entity. So that's pretty ripe a concept to explore in a sequel, and has so many different opportunities for them to touch upon. Like the host of these games, dressed to look like Sol Invictus, says that he'd grant your wish and any desire that comes with it. And there's plenty of directions one could take that if they wanted to build on those ideas of meritocracy, classism, and the ways one can reshape society if that's the main premise of this game. I originally started writing this video to weigh on whether or not this is a prequel or sequel, but the more I thought about it, the more I feel like the discourse is sort of missing the point about why this is a big deal, because whether it's a prequel or a sequel, this is a game that is ripe with opportunities to build upon the themes of its predecessor, and it can't take the easy route to do so because of the density of the lore of the world that it's choosing to explore them in. Like, it would have been much easier to approach a hypothetical follow-up to Three Houses in a world that is largely disconnected from its predecessor a la Fire Emblem Fates, not having much connection to Awakening aside from the appearance of some second-generation fan favorites in the DLC. And doing that, it would have been entirely expected of intelligence systems just to do so, just to have Fire Emblem 3 Houses 0.5. Just use the basic idea of Three Houses in a world that they started from scratch because, well, that's just sort of the standard for Fire Emblem sequels. Namely because Fire Emblem doesn't do traditional, normal, quote-unquote, sequels, or even normal prequels for that matter, certainly not very often. I already mentioned Fates as doing its own thing after Awakening, but Gaiden might as well be its 8-bit contemporary, a game largely disconnected from the first Fire Emblem that goes on to tell its own story with a mostly new cast, along with the 3 Pegasi sisters, and Camus for the first game popping in for the adventure. 3C776 is a midquel, and a really odd one at that when you think about when they decided to place the story. Reika no Ken, aka the 7th one, aka the one that's just called Fire Emblem, is a prequel, as is BS Fire Emblem, but both of them don't share a lot thematically with their predecessors. The DS games are more or less remakes of Book 1 and Book 2 from Moshino no Nasa, and Awakening, well, it might be the most out of left field entry lore-wise, with it taking place well after the conclusions of Gaiden and Book 2, not to mention how it incorporated the Judral duology, to the point where it feels almost divorced from those games because of just how much time has passed between those events and everything that's changed since then, the land, the people, and this is before we get into the DLC where things get even stranger. It made sense for that game to paint this world with as broad a brush as possible to tackle every facet and every corner of Fire Emblem, given that it was designed to potentially be the last game in the series and thus going out on top as a love letter to fans, but again, thematically it's disconnected and not much of a real follow-up to the events of those games, at least not directly. And yes, I'm including the additional lore that they had in Shadows of Valentia. Again, the story that they were telling within the game basically has nothing to do with what happens in Awakening. In fact, it kind of makes things seem a little strange because they never try and go get the falchion from Valentia, ever. There's lots of fan service, mentioning of names for characters and weapons from previous games, but not much of connective tissue between said material and the games they come from, their various themes and ideas. The closest you can really get is the idea of Grimas being a sort of successor to Medius and him saying that he's going to come back because of the evilness in men's hearts. Oh, and in case you're wondering, Sacred Stones, aside from the aforementioned DLC connections that every game in the series has because of Awakening, it is completely divorced from the rest of the series. No sequel, no prequel, nothing. And honestly, I hope it stays that way because aside from making it a very unique entry in the series, if Intelligent Systems even thinks of desecrating my sweet boy Lion's grave, someone is going to fall. The only games in Fire Emblem's history that are direct continuations, keyword being direct, ones where the main cast and events from a previous entry are integral to the story told in that game, and the themes and ideas of its previous entry are further explored, are Radiant Dawn and Moshino no Naza, and not even the full game, it's just Book 2. That said, as unique as it makes these two games within the series, technically 1 3/4, Book 2 is longer than the first one. Frankly, only one of these does a good job of building off of their predecessor's gameplay or narrative. And no, it's not the one that badly executes a story that, on paper, makes for an intriguing flipping of the proverbial table of what was previously established in Path of Radiance. Also, it completely wastes the idea of a multi-protagonist narrative. Also, the maps are way worse than you probably remember. In fact, a lot of them just are terrible. Bottom 10 in the series potential. One survives. Jeffrey's Charge. That swamp stage that I don't even need to look up the name of because you know exactly which one I'm referring to. If there's anything to take away from Radiant Dawn, it's that execution is key, so a more direct sequel is not entirely without concern. Now, whether Fortune's Weave does join this duo does remain to be seen because it's way too early to say whether or not it will actually build on those aforementioned themes and ideas that Three Houses explored, or how it does so, i.e. if the execution will stick the landing. But at least thus far, it does seem that they're going to try and follow it up. And like I said, making a follow-up to a Fire Emblem game, however indirect, is complicated as is because of how much one has to consider the world that they originally built. How does it change based on the actions that took place prior to it? Or how do the events from the game that you're making as a prequel affect your perspective of the events that take place in the quote-unquote sequel? If it is set in the future of Fodlan, well, we don't know just how far out it'll be. Maybe it's a few generations? Maybe it's more of an awakening situation where so much time has passed that the landscape is unrecognizable. Even just this brief glimpse shows us a pretty different world than the one we got used to through the tetra of playthroughs for Three Houses 4 routes. If it's set in the past, you have to figure out how to tell a story that can only turn over so many stones without contradicting what was previously established. Like, the prequel trilogy couldn't end with Anakin Skywalker killing the Emperor, you know what I mean? Again, execution is key, don't take that as an endorsement or praise. That said, if you want a positive example of this, Rekken no Ken, despite some of its narrative flaws and localization issues, handled this pretty well, combining a story of star-crossed lovers with a story that quite literally had to be self-contained to not have severe political ramifications for the main players in Fuendo Tsurugi, and it helps that it marries the narrative and the gameplay so well together. There is one thing that is pretty clear though. Whether sequel, prequel, or something else entirely, there is a lot beyond the obvious consideration for continuity that's ripe to build off of, and, at least so far, it looks like they're going to make use of this world to its fullest as a follow-up of some variety to Three Houses. Now, this is of course assuming that they don't just do what Nintendo did with the Zelda timeline and cop out. You know, making up some hypothetical timeline where the events of Three Houses or Hopes plays out in a way that the player was never able to foresee or would have predicted. Like, nobody's going into this game expecting Lady Rhea to have successfully revived her mother, which resulted in the death of Byleth and that being the catalyst for the entire game. Though as of right now, who knows exactly why she's here and an adult at that? And who exactly is she talking to? Lots of questions, not a lot of answers. If nothing else, I'm intrigued with the premise. Love that they're taking some inspiration from Carthaginian mercantilism of all things. And a little excited to see what form this follow-up to an entry that honestly only lukewarm on will take. To be clear, Three Houses was a great game overall, but as a Fire Emblem game specifically, it left me wanting and disappointed. Narratively, design-wise, and especially tactics-wise. Fortune's Weave's announcement is probably the most interested I've been in a Fire Emblem game since Fates, and if it can live up to the hype, then well, it'll have a lot more going for it than the last entry did at least. Yeah, didn't care much for Engage, it's the only Fire Emblem game that I've never even finished. That's all for now folks, until next time, game on my friends.